Welcome back to Ben's Book Club. Today we are diving into the book Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment. Imagine for a second stepping into the heavily guarded, ultra-secretive corridors of European power. You're trying to save your completely bankrupt country, right? But instead of a standard negotiation, do you find yourself dumped right in the middle of a ruthless, high-stakes political thriller? Well, that is exactly the story we're unpacking in today's Explainer. We're going to look at what actually happens when a country teetering on the brink of financial ruin tries to renegotiate its very survival against some of the most powerful institutions on Earth. It's a massive story about crushing debt, the very real limits of democracy, and ultimately betrayal. And we're going to frame this whole thing as a clash of two very different worldviews, an idealist economist going toe-to-toe with a pragmatic technocrat.
Now, honestly, nothing sets the tone for this clash quite like this famous quote, "What we need is adults in the room." Yeah, this was a famously condescending remark dropped by Christine Lagarde, who was heading up the International Monetary Fund at the time. And boom, it instantly establishes the intensely adversarial vibe of this whole saga. On one side, you've got the establishment essentially viewing themselves as the responsible adults, and on the other, an upstart government they basically saw as a toddler throwing a tantrum. But as we'll see, the question of who is actually acting responsibly, well, that's exactly what's up for debate.
So here are our rules of engagement for today. We'll hit 1. The crisis and the club, 2. Debate, math versus rules, 3. Debate, democracy versus institutions, 4. Insiders and outsiders, 5. The referendum and betrayal, and finally, 6. The final verdict. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The crisis and the club, entering the Eurogroup trap.
Okay, let's set the scene. The year is early 2015, and Greece is just in the absolute depths of a brutal economic depression. After years of punishing austerity, the Greek people decide they've had enough, and they elect the radical left-wing Syriza party. Their mandate? Stop the bleeding. Now, the new government appoints Yanis Varoufakis, an academic economist, as finance minister to renegotiate this frankly crushing debt. But standing directly in his way is what he calls the deep establishment. More specifically, a group known as the Troika. This is an unelected, highly powerful alliance made up of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. They're the ones holding the purse strings, and they are strictly enforcing the economic bailout terms that Greece so desperately wants to change.
And this brings us right to our two main opponents in this showdown. In one corner, we have the idealist economist Yanis Varoufakis. Picture a motorcycle-riding academic, totally brand new to career politics, walking into the room armed with raw data, economic logic, and a massive democratic mandate from Greek voters. Then, in the opposite corner, we have the pragmatic technocrat, represented by the Troika and the European finance ministers. These are the architects of the existing system. They are entirely focused on enforcing the rules, preserving the overall Eurozone architecture, and above all, maintaining institutional power. It is a textbook clash of worldviews.
Which brings us to Section 2. Debate, math versus rules. Round 1, the economics.
So round 1 zeroes in on the sheer, unavoidable mathematical reality of the bailout demands. Our idealist economist looks at the numbers and argues that imposing severe austerity, heavy spending cuts and huge tax hikes during a massive recession is basically a destructive debt deflation trap. By his logic, if you shrink the economy, paying back the debt actually becomes mathematically impossible. It's just bad math. But our pragmatic technocrat counters that austerity is absolutely required. For them, hey, it's not just about Greece's balance sheet, it's about preventing moral hazard. They argue these rules must be strictly enforced to send a strong message to other European countries like France, Italy, or Spain, just to ensure the survival of the wider Eurozone project.
And this argument is forcefully illustrated by one absolutely staggering number, -25%. Under the Troika's previous bailout terms, Greece's GDP had already plummeted by a massive 25%. Varoufakis argued that continuing these same demands was just absurd. I mean, think about it, like a bank demanding that a bankrupt person work fewer hours while simultaneously raising their mortgage payments. It just doesn't work. But the technocrats, they simply refused to budge on the rules, no matter how bad the actual math looked on the ground.
All right, Section 3. Debate, democracy versus institutions. Round 2. The politics.
Because you see, this wasn't just an economic crisis, it was deeply political. If round 1 was about math, round 2 shifts entirely to the legitimacy of power itself. The idealist economist insists that the democratic will of the Greek voters, who, remember, just overwhelmingly elected an anti-austerity government, must dictate the country's policy. Basically, the people have spoken, right? But the pragmatic technocrat operates on a completely different frequency. For them, supranational institutional power and systemic survival always override national elections. From their perspective, one single country's election results absolutely cannot be allowed to upend the established financial order of an entire continent.
And to really understand how these technocrats wield their institutional power, you have to look at the environment where these decisions actually happen. Varoufakis was utterly shocked to discover that the Eurogroup meets entirely behind closed doors. They don't even keep official minutes of their meetings. There is virtually zero public accountability. This is the deep establishment in action, operating in near total secrecy, totally immune to the democratic pressures that politicians back home have to face.
Moving on to Section 4, Insiders and Outsiders, the Larry Summers Doctrine.
Here we transition away from dense economic theory into the raw human pursuit of power. During a pivotal, behind-the-scenes private dinner in Washington, Varoufakis met with Larry Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary. And Summers delivered this chilling ultimatum that perfectly crystallizes how global power actually functions. He looked at him and said, "There are two kinds of politicians, insiders and outsiders. You have to decide which one you want to be." It wasn't just a casual observation, folks. It was a test.
Let's break down this dichotomy because it's fascinating. Summers explained that insiders do whatever is necessary to protect the system. They never leak to the press, they play strictly by the club's rules, and in return, they get to wield actual power and influence. Outsiders, on the other hand, prioritize speaking the truth. They get to keep their integrity, sure, but they are systematically ignored, marginalized, and completely locked out of the real decision-making. Faced with this choice, Varoufakis emphatically chose the outsider path. Actually, he took it a step further. He started secretly recording those unminuted Eurogroup meetings and leaking them as a weapon of radical transparency against the establishment.
Which sets the stage for Section 5, the referendum and betrayal, the climax of the standoff. All of this intense ideological friction was bound to spark a massive fire. Let's walk through this timeline to see exactly how 6 months of standoff escalated into an explosive summer in 2015. In January, you have the optimism and hope of the Syriza election, but by June, negotiations hit a total wall of absolute brinksmanship. The European Central Bank starts threatening to completely shut down the Greek banking system, essentially suffocating the country's cash supply. So in July, to break the deadlock, the Greek government calls a historic impromptu referendum, asking the people directly if they should accept the harsh bailout terms. And then, mere days later, we see the final shocking capitulation. But let's pause on that historic vote for a second, because it really represents a massive narrative peak here. The Greek citizens were terrified, their banks were literally closed, but they still went to the polls and voted an overwhelming 61% no, or oxy in Greek. They resoundingly rejected further austerity. It was an undeniable thunderous democracy mandate. The idealist economist had seemingly won the argument on the ground. The people undeniably had his back.
But then comes the twist. Despite the massive no vote by the people and under immense, crushing pressure and threats from the ECB to pull the plug on the banks, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras folds. He capitulates completely, signing an agreement for an even harsher bailout than the one the voters had just rejected. The technocrats' institutional power utterly crushed the democratic mandate. Seeing his own side fold and the voters' mandate totally ignored, Varoufakis immediately resigns in protest, refusing to sign what he viewed as a humiliating surrender. Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, the final verdict, legacy in the modern world.
Let's zoom out for a minute and assess what this incredibly intense battle actually reveals about the structure of our world today. The legacy of Yanis Varoufakis and his 6-month showdown is fiercely polarizing. The pro-Varoufakis camp sees him as a heroic, idealist truth-teller. They view him as someone who bravely exposed a corrupt, undemocratic European oligarchy that was literally willing to destroy a nation's economy just to save face for foreign banks. However, his critics view him entirely differently. They see him as an arrogant narcissist, a showman who treated high-stakes, real-world diplomacy like some academic game theory lecture, needlessly alienating allies and pushing his country to the absolute brink of total ruin. As always in this explainer, we aren't taking sides. You have to decide which side of the argument you fall on.
But regardless of how you view the messenger, The core message of this story leaves us pondering a truly profound final thought. When economic rules conflict with democracy, which one wins? In 2015 Greece, the unelected institutions clearly won and the voters lost. It's a sobering reality check on how global power functions behind closed doors. Think about that the next time you cast a ballot, and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.